The Vatican is often described as the wealthiest religious institution on the planet. Its palaces, its cathedrals, its collections of art and relics can stand beside the national galleries and cultural archives of entire countries. Its vaults and treasuries contain works that are essentially beyond price. Its financial arms quietly handle and protect vast sums of money. Its reach extends from elite financial circles to the most fragile communities on Earth. But here is the part that usually gets ignored. This fortune was not a miracle that simply appeared out of nowhere. It did not descend untouched from the heavens. It was assembled. It was constructed piece by piece. And like every major fortune that has ever existed, its base wasn't made purely of prayer and preaching. It was built with money, strategy, leverage, and arrangements that would make many ordinary believers deeply uncomfortable if they saw them up close. This story is not a debate about doctrine. It is not about saints or miracles. It is about systems. It is about economics, because the history of Vatican wealth is at its core, the history of how a faith, which began as a persecuted movement, became a global financial force, and how, across time, money became as essential to organized religion as liturgy. The path begins at a very specific turning point, the exact moment Christianity gained legal protection and state favor. In the year 313 after Christ, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued what is known as the Edict of Milan. This declaration legalized Christianity throughout the empire and effectively shut down the cycles of violent persecution that Christians had lived under for generations. Almost instantly, what had been an outlaw faith operating quietly in private homes and under threat was elevated to a protected, politically recognized religion. With that stamp of legitimacy came material rewards. Wealthy Roman elites began transferring property. Members of the imperial class and powerful families handed over estates, buildings, and valuables. Emperors themselves, starting with Constantine, granted privileges and material support. Constantine personally financed the construction of the first St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a monumental gesture that signaled a new age. The message embedded in these moves was unmistakable. Holiness and wealth could coexist, and spiritual authority could be reinforced by visible splendor and institutional resources. From that early moment, the Church absorbed a core lesson that empires already understood, that money fuels authority, and authority in turn protects money. By the early Middle Ages, the Church had refined a mechanism that would become one of its most reliable engines of income, the tithe. The principle was direct and backed by religious obligation. Every believer owed 1/10 of their income or production to the Church. 10% of what you grew, earned, harvested, or produced belonged to God's institution, and withholding it was not treated like skipping a donation. It was treated like endangering your soul. This revenue did not stay stuck at the local level. It moved upward in a steady chain from parish to bishopric to higher offices, and ultimately helped feed Rome's authority. Imagine the position of an ordinary medieval farmer struggling just to keep enough grain to survive the winter, and still being required to surrender 1/10 of that harvest for the sake of religious duty. The tithe functioned like a tax. It was enforced not by soldiers at first, but by fear of spiritual consequence. Over time, this structure did more than just gather money. It transferred land, labor, and security into the Church's hands. The long-term effect of this system was massive. Over centuries, those tithes, along with steady gifts and inherited lands, turned the Church into the single biggest landholder in Western Europe. By around the year 1000, estimates suggest that the Catholic Church held control over nearly 1/3 of all land in that region. This was not just an inventory of churches and cloisters. We are talking about farmland, vineyards, mills, forests, productive assets that generated concrete, recurring wealth. That land produced crops, rent, timber, and influence. In an age before modern financial markets, land was the ultimate form of real capital, and the Church accumulated it on a breathtaking scale. This made it not only a religious authority, but effectively a feudal power embedded directly into the structure of European daily life. But the story does not stop at land and tithes. That would already be enough to make the Church powerful. It gets darker than that, because soon the institution discovered there was even more money to be extracted from belief itself. By the 11th century, the Church had refined and popularized one of its most controversial financial tools, indulgences. The concept was simple to explain and devastatingly effective. The Church taught that sin carried consequences after death, and that time spent suffering in purgatory could be reduced. An indulgence was presented as a way to lessen that punishment, for you, or even for someone already dead, in exchange for payment. In other words, contribute money to the Church, and in return, you or your loved one could receive spiritual relief. It was redemption packaged as a transaction. Indulgences produced a torrent of income. This was not limited to repairing buildings or maintaining clergy. The money from indulgences funded campaigns, infrastructure, and eventually even military action. Because by that time, the Church had evolved far beyond being merely a network of parishes. It had become a geopolitical actor. That is the context in which the Crusades were launched in 1096. The Crusades are remembered and described as holy wars, as military expeditions justified in the name of faith. But those campaigns were also an enormous financial operation. Armies are expensive. Mobilization requires gold. To raise it, the Church imposed new forms of taxation related to these wars. And for those who were unable to personally march into battle, indulgences were offered as an alternative. You could make a payment instead of making the journey, and your contribution would still, you were told, count towards sacred aims. As these campaigns advanced, when cities fell and territories were seized, wealth was not only symbolically claimed for God, it was materially captured. Treasures were taken. Land and resources in the conquered regions could be redirected toward the papacy and its allies. By the time the waves of crusading had subsided, the Vatican was sitting not just on moral authority, but on real, militarized leverage. It had demonstrated that it could tax, mobilize, and extract resources across borders in a way that rivaled kings. And at home, the contrast was striking. While parish priests spoke publicly about modesty, about the spiritual danger of greed, the central institution of the Church was accumulating a scale of property, treasure, and fiscal power that no monarch in Europe could easily match. It is the familiar formula that repeats itself in powerful systems throughout history. One narrative is delivered to ordinary people, a narrative about sacrifice and humility, while the machinery behind the scenes consolidates wealth. As the centuries moved forward, the Vatican did not just sit as a landlord, it became something even more influential, a financial broker. By the later Middle Ages and moving into the Renaissance, the papacy had turned into one of the key centers of money and negotiation in Europe. The person of the Pope was no longer imagined only as a guardian of souls. He functioned like a ruler, with court politics, territorial ambitions, and a treasury. And like any ruler of that time, he needed constant cash flow. That money was not only for relief to the poor or for repairing places of worship, it was also needed to pay for private guards and armies, to commission the arts on a grand scale, and to compete visually and politically with crowned monarchs. The main symbol of this ambition, and the main financial burden that came with it, was St. Peter's Basilica. The original basilica sponsored by Constantine had, by the 1500s, decayed. The papacy did not want a simple renovation. It wanted a cathedral so overwhelming in size and beauty that nothing else in Christianity would rival it. But prestige is expensive. Monumental construction at that level demanded enormous sums. To generate those sums, the Vatican leaned even harder on indulgences. Preachers fanned out across Europe, selling formal documents that promised less time in purgatory. The pitch was direct and emotionally targeted. People were haunted by the imagined suffering of their relatives after death, and the Church offered a pathway to ease that suffering for a fee. One Dominican friar, Johann Tetzel, became infamous for his slogan-like sales pitch, a line that has survived through the centuries. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The message to the listener was chillingly clear. A single coin, placed in the collection, could instantly help liberate a soul from torment. People who had very little still handed over what they had, convinced they were buying something sacred and urgent. The money gathered through these indulgence campaigns did not only pour into Masons' wages and marble budgets, it also supported the lifestyles of the Renaissance papal court. The popes of that era lived as sovereign princes. Alexander VI, from the notorious Borgia family, presided over a papacy marked by favoritism, open luxury, and scandal. Leo X, a member of the powerful Medici family, spent lavishly on art, celebrations, and display, even while much of Rome lived in hunger. The contradiction stood in plain sight. Public sermons condemned greed as a moral poison, yet the central institution of the Church surrounded itself with wealth dramatic enough to provoke envy from actual kings. Outwardly, humility and charity were praised. Internally, wealth was showcased as proof of divine favor and political dominance. At the same time, behind these displays, the Vatican had embraced something else: the mechanics of banking. Official teaching still labeled usury, charging interest on loans, as sinful. But in practice, popes worked closely with the era's influential banking families, such as the Lombards and the Medicis, to circulate, protect, and quietly expand church funds. The papal court emerged as a major financial node. It did not just oversee its own revenue, it became involved in the debts and finances of rulers. Kings owed money to private bankers. Those bankers worked with, or depended on, Rome. This made the Vatican a kind of nerve center, with money and obligation radiating outward like the strands of a web. But systems like this are always vulnerable to exposure. Eventually, there was a breaking point. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther publicly challenged what the Church had become. He published his 95 Theses and attacked Indulgences in particular, calling them a deception. He argued that salvation could not be purchased, that the entire practice of selling spiritual relief for money was corrupt, and that Rome's grand wealth had been financed through the pressure and fear imposed on the poor. His protest triggered what became known as the Reformation, which tore Europe apart religiously and politically. Entire regions and nations began to reject the Vatican's authority. The sale of indulgences, which had been the financial engine behind the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica, the very crown jewel the Vatican wanted the world to see, now stood as the most visible sign of abuse. The irony in that moment is unavoidable. The same mechanism that financed the Church's most spectacular architectural symbol also ignited a mass revolt that permanently fractured Christianity in the West. Wealth had produced splendor. At the same time, wealth had nurtured anger, and anger had turned into separation. And that kind of anger, once it hardens into open resistance, is not something any empire can easily buy back. By the 1600s, the Vatican remained rich in land and influence, but the Reformation had wounded its prestige. The papacy no longer spoke to Europe as a single unquestioned authority. Its image had been damaged. But its deeper operating logic, the fusion of spiritual messaging and financial extraction, did not vanish. It adapted. The institution continued to function with the same formula. Publicly, a story of duty, devotion, and eternal truth. Structurally, an engine that converted loyalty and fear into tangible assets. Even after losing the allegiance of vast territories and millions of believers, the Vatican kept finding ways to translate belief into revenue streams and to defend those streams. For many centuries, the Church's fortune was held in things like land and taxation and indulgence money. But in the 19th century, that order broke apart. The Vatican, until then, did not just guide consciences. It controlled physical territory known as the Papal States, covering large parts of central Italy. That land was not symbolic. It provided rents. It provided authority backed by force. It made the Pope, in a literal sense, a territorial ruler with his own state. Then, in 1870, during the unification of Italy, those papal states were seized and absorbed into the new Italian nation. Overnight, the Pope lost direct control of that territory, and with it, the steady stream of financial and political benefits that came from owning, taxing, and defending land at that scale. The Vatican, at least from the outside, appeared stripped down. It no longer had armies in the same way. It no longer had vast territorial rents. Many observers assumed that its financial dominance had been permanently broken, but institutions that have been shaped around money for over 1,000 years do not simply surrender that habit. They reinvent. And the Vatican did exactly that in the 20th century. The key moment came in 1929 with an agreement that often gets overlooked in popular memory, the Lateran Treaty. Benito Mussolini, who was leading fascist Italy and wanted the Church's cooperation and moral support, negotiated directly with the Vatican. The treaty did more than confirm the Vatican's sovereignty over a tiny independent city-state, Vatican City. The agreement also transferred a massive payout to the Church as compensation for the territories it had lost decades earlier. The package included 750 million lire in cash and 1 billion lire in government bonds. When adjusted into modern value, that represents billions of dollars. In practical terms, it was a bailout. Mussolini stabilized his relationship with the Church, and, in return, the Vatican received a new financial base powerful enough to rescue it from what had looked like collapse. With that cash and those bonds, the Vatican assembled a modern financial instrument, the Institute for Religious Works, widely known as the Vatican Bank. Officially, this institution existed to handle the money of religious orders and church charities. Officially, it served pious causes. In reality, it became a discrete financial hub protected by sovereignty and secrecy. It operated beyond normal levels of outside scrutiny, which gave it the freedom to move money, cultivate influence, and position itself in global affairs. As the 20th century moved forward, the bank's role extended far beyond mere safekeeping. During the Cold War period, Vatican funds were directed in ways meant to support political goals, including efforts aligned against communism. By the 1980s, the bank's name surfaced in one of the most notorious financial scandals of that era, involving Banco Ambrosiano. In that scandal, vast sums vanished. The chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Roberto Calvi, a man who became known in the press as God's banker because of his deep links to Vatican finance, was discovered dead under Blackfriars Bridge in London. His body was found hanging, and his pockets were weighed down with bricks. His death was ultimately ruled a murder. Afterward, investigators and journalists drew connections between the fallout of Banco Ambrosiano and allegations of links tying the Vatican Bank to criminal organizations, intelligence interests, and laundering operations. Those shadows have followed the Vatican Bank's reputation ever since. Again, the contrast is impossible to ignore. The same institution that preaches humility and poverty had, by this point, mastered techniques of high finance that would not look out of place inside elite corporate circles. It had developed wealth first through land, taxation, and indulgences. It had then resurrected that wealth through political deals and financial engineering. And it protected that wealth with layers of confidentiality and insulation that any major banking executive would recognize and respect. Even when scandals erupted, from Banco Ambrosiano to repeated accusations about illicit flows of money, the Vatican remained in a special position. It was seen as spiritually untouchable, historically essential, and therefore, in practice, too sacred to bring down fully. In the present day, the exact total of the Vatican's wealth is not openly known. That number is obscured. Its collections of art alone, the frescoes of Raphael, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo, represent cultural assets that are essentially beyond normal market calculation. These works cannot be sold, at least in theory, because they are considered part of humanity's heritage. But if you attempted to assign them a price, you would arrive at figures in the billions. The Vatican also continues to hold land and financial positions through its institutions, yet full visibility into those holdings is blocked by structure and jurisdiction. Publicly, the Vatican presents budgets that look modest, even tight. On paper, it can appear almost humble. But if you examine the historical pattern, a different conclusion emerges. What is presented in public often functions as a controlled display, and that display itself becomes a tool of influence. That leads to the final point. The Vatican's wealth did not fall out of the sky. It was not a passive inheritance. It was accumulated, defended, and rebuilt over and over again. It was assembled through compulsory tithes that acted like a spiritual tax. It was expanded through land control. It was fueled by indulgences, which turned fear of the afterlife into revenue. It was reinforced through alliances with rulers and, later, with political regimes. It was stabilized by treaties that delivered massive payments. It was modernized through a bank that could quietly move funds where they needed to go. The pattern is consistent. The institution learned to take belief, package it, and convert it into material advantage. This narrative is not only about religion, it is about the structure of power in general. The Vatican in this telling is not an outlier. It is an example of a model that repeats in other systems. Whenever a government declares that its currency is stable while aggressively creating more of it, it is asking for trust in a story that may not match the underlying mechanics. When a corporation publicly praises values and ethics while quietly pushing its labor force to the absolute limit, it is using the same split approach that the medieval church used: one face for the public, one engine for control. When a bank assures depositors that their money is completely safe while simultaneously risking that money through complex maneuvers, it is following the same logic. The formula is stable across time. On the surface, there is faith. Faith in virtue, faith in stability, faith in moral purpose. Beneath the surface, there is the spreadsheet. So when someone looks at the marble and gold, at the halls of the Vatican and the paintings that fill them, what they are seeing is not only a religious heritage, they are seeing one of the oldest living demonstrations of a principle that keeps repeating through history. Wealth that is built quietly and defended ruthlessly almost always presents itself in the language of goodness. It wears respectability as armor. It wears morality as a shield. And because that combination is so effective, it survives long after critics have spoken out against it. The lesson is blunt. The past shows that systems of power will always tell a story designed to secure loyalty. They will always frame obedience as virtue. They will always portray their accumulation of resources as necessary, justified, and even holy. Meanwhile, those same systems direct that loyalty and that obedience into revenue. That cycle is not just something that happened in the medieval world. It exists anywhere people are told that trust is mandatory and questioning is disloyal. Understanding that pattern does not mean abandoning belief. It means recognizing how belief has been used. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.